LogRhythm's Netmon Freemium delivers real-time network visibility to quickly identify emerging threats in your IT environment. Netmon Freemium is a free commercial-grade network forensics and traffic analytics solution. You can use Netmon Freemium's powerful capabilities to search against all of observed network traffic, identify abnormal traffic patterns in application usage, and quickly analyze full packet captures. Take the first step towards real-time network visibility. Visit logRhythm.com/freemium to learn more and download it today. The Threat Connect platform enables organizations to identify, manage, and block threats faster with threat intelligence, automation, and orchestration, providing security teams a platform to unite their people, processes, and technologies behind an intelligence-driven defense. Threat Connect helps increase visibility into networks and integrates with defense tools to close the gap between threat detection and response. Get your free Threat Connect account today by visiting threatconnect.com/securityweekly. Endgame automates the hunt for both known and never-before-seen adversaries in enterprise networks. Built on unique knowledge on the adversary's tools, techniques, and tactics, Endgame's centrally managed agent prevents, detects, and responds to advanced adversaries at the earliest stages of the kill chain without prior knowledge. Endgame. Automate the hunt.
Welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. So this segment, we were contacted by HP, and they told us that they wanted to do some printer security. And they were looking for people to come and hear about what they've been doing. Did I get the gist of that right, Jeff? No, Jeff, you're the one that actually attended the event and got all the juicy details.
Yep.
But that was basically the high-level 50,000-foot overview.
Yeah, I think it was essentially a marketing effort at the end of the day. They're trying to, they've done a lot in terms of printer security, and they wanted to put it out there to sort of industry bloggers, tech bloggers, security bloggers. So they wanted to show off what they've been doing, but they also wanted to get feedback and
Yes.
kind of start a conversation. Are they doing the right things? Are they doing some things wrong? Are there things that they could be doing better, that type of thing?
I thought it's significant enough that I wanted to cover it. There's another large company, Jeff, I'll tell you after, that wants to do a similar kind of thing. And I mean, these are companies that are significant enough where we need to cover this kind of information. Jeff volunteered to go out there and represent Security Weekly and get all the details. And it sounds like you had a blast, actually. So I want to hear all about it.
Yeah, it was a great time. So they had about a dozen of us come out to visit headquarters in Palo Alto. We flew in last Tuesday, and they started with a welcome reception and I'm learning all about HP as I was going along. Mm-hmm. Question to Joff and to Paul: when you think of HP, what do you think about? What's your earliest memory of HP or Hewlett Packard?
Wanting to throw their printers out the window after getting support call after support.
Yeah,
support
I mean,
call.
it
was more Lexmark that I wanted to destroy.
Right.
But HP actually made good printers that actually worked really well. I mean, when I got into the university, like early 2000s, I noticed security was pretty terrible. And that trend kind of continued. Of course, HP makes laptops and computers and servers too, with various security incidents, whatever. But they're a player in that space certainly. But obviously, they're known for printers.
Right.
Yeah. I mean,
well,
that just to sort of chime in on that. That's what I think of too. But for a long time, I was in the network business, and I have some interesting memories of like layer 2 op scanning activity coming from HP printers. So they had some interesting protocol activities.
Yeah,
in the
I think weird protocols. Like what's the line printer
LPD? Yeah,
LPD. But they had what's the language?
IPP, PCL.
PCL is the weird language. Yeah.
PC load letter.
Yeah, it's weird. Weird protocols come to mind, Jeff. Also, I think, as Larry will share with you stories or a story on this, and I've had similar experiences, and a lot of us have fond memories when we were like scanning the network back in the day, and you'd come across a printer, and it would just keep printing like garbage characters over and over and over again. And in Larry's story, they just kept like feeding it reams of paper and went through like boxes of paper. So,
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So that's
Well-
kind of the perception that I think from my understanding they're trying to change, and asking folks for feedback. And so Jeff, continue.
Right. So, and that's just mostly from the printer perspective. My earliest memory of HP is pocket calculators, scientific calculators. I remember very distinctly when my brother graduated from high school, which was in 1973. His graduation present was a Hewlett-Packard scientific calculator. I mean, in 1973, it cost $300-400. It was a big deal, and he took that and went off to Duke University as a physics major. So that's my earliest memory. But it turns out Hewlett-Packard as a company started in 1938. So the welcome reception at the very beginning, and I'm sharing this, there's a point to this, so, but it's cool anyway. They rented a house in Palo Alto. They were both Stanford graduates, and they were trying to figure out a business. One guy was more the gearhead, one guy was more the business guy. I don't remember which one was which. And they ended up, the very first product that they produced that they were actually able to sell was an audio oscillator, which produced a clean audio tone, one tone at a time. Their first customer was Walt Disney, and he bought a bunch of these oscillators and used it to make the movie Fantasia. So the house that they started this all in, and they actually, there was a garage behind the house, and they had to rent space in the garage that was their research lab. This was where we had our welcome reception, and Hewlett-Packard acquired this property some years ago, and they keep it closed down. It's sort of like a museum, but it's only open for VIPs. So we were VIPs. So I got to be a VIP last week. Awesome. And there were even people from HP that said, "Yeah, we'll come to the welcome reception. It'll be our first opportunity to see the house and the garage." So that's where it all started. The reason I bring that up is when they started the tech day, they called it. One of the executives got up and spoke about how HP has a long history. In fact, the garage where they created this oscillator, that's credited as being the birthplace of Silicon Valley. So that's it has a little National Historic Registry sign out in front of it and everything.
That's
so
really cool.
That was all kind of cool. I was clueless, so I was like, wow, that's I was just being Joe Tourist at that point, sucking it, taking it all in.
Were there like floppy disks of HPUX laying around?
I asked them about HPUX. They don't like to talk about that.
Oh, interesting. Apparently that's a System 3 derivative, entirely closed source, obviously. So. Yeah,
and I should clarify, because they certainly did. The company split off in the recent past, and there's now HP Incorporated and Hewlett-Packard Enterprise.
Gotcha.
And the print division is HP Incorporated, so that's
yes, I remember that. Yep.
But we were at the Welcome Center, Visitor Center, where they preserved the offices of Hewlett and Packard once they were in a building. I mean, they're set up. It looks like, sort of 1950s, 60s furniture and everything. It was very cool. So, the purpose of the day obviously was talk about printer security, and they started out by saying, and I think this speaks to their corporate culture, and for young people that are, and certainly young companies that have grown up in the technology age, the idea of having a corporate culture, while we talk about it, may not be as big a thing as it is for HP. So they're very proud of their heritage. They're very proud of the fact that they're, do the math, 75-year-old company. They've been involved in lots of different things. They went on and on about the hundreds and thousands of patents they own. We actually got a tour. The last thing we did was a tour of the HP labs, and we got to see stuff that they're working on that may or may not become products. And it was mind-blowing, some of the stuff that they're working on. Some of the 3D printing technology, and they were showing us things that they'd printed. And it's just amazing. It made me feel stupid. It's like, we're talking about security breaking into stuff. These guys are building things that just boggle the imagination. And I was thinking, if some of their researchers and developers could harness some of that creativity for some of these security problems that we struggle with and don't seem to ever get anywhere with. maybe the world would be a better place. But they started the day by saying that they felt, in terms of printer security, given the long history of the insecurity of printers and the way that printers have been very easily exploited over the years. I don't know if you guys are old enough to have done this, but when I was first breaking into printers, it was finding them using a war dialer. Chris probably has done that too. But they had a modem built in. That was a way to get into the network if the front door was closed, right? And then all the other insecurities that have happened over the years. And the other kind of idea that I had, and I mentioned it to you guys, I think off the air a couple weeks ago, was, when you think about printers and all the talk that we've been having on multiple episodes about the Internet of Things, printers are kind of the original Internet of Things.
Yes.
They're like the granddaddy of the Internet of Things in terms of uncontrolled devices that are on your network that nobody thinks about, and nobody thinks about applying security controls or how are they configured and stuff like that. So I really went into it trying to not only learn what they were doing about printer security, but also see if they were doing things sort of in line with what we've been talking about is, how do we solve this Internet of Thing problem? Maybe they're doing some things that other vendors could learn from, or maybe HP is going to take the lead in terms of doing the right thing in terms of IoT security or printer security.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, Jeff, because I remember very fondly, like, one of my first kind of research endeavors into embedded systems was HP printers.
Right. So. Well, and so it's we learned a lot. We were certainly exposed to a lot of things that they're doing, and I'll try to kind of go over the highlights here. Sure. I'm in the process of writing sort of a trip report, a blog, which is one of the things that they asked us to do, which I should have it wrapped up probably tomorrow or early next week, and that'll be available on our website. We can link to it from the recording of this session.
Yep.
But I think they encapsulated the problem pretty well. They started off by talking about, there's sort of two approaches. You can either teach your customers about printer security, or you can create a secure printer. And I think they've spent a certain amount of time trying to do sort of the awareness thing. Don't just slap a printer on your network. Know that there's things that you need to change.
Right.
And
well, I think up until it sounds like recently, they've kind of failed at both, to be quite honest with you.
Well, and they pretty much acknowledged that. They certainly acknowledged that their marketing programs hadn't been terribly successful. The things that they'd been doing in terms of customer awareness weren't terribly successful. So they've started looking into, okay, how do we produce a secure printer? And they said there's basically three problems with printers being deployed on networks. And I think, we could argue this, but I think this pretty much applies to IoT. So I think there's some overlap here. The first thing is what they called basically port security. What is the device listening on? What will it respond to? The second category is what they call configuration security or configuration settings, and I think you would sort of lump default passwords and default accounts into that category. How do you configure the thing in a secure manner? And then the third aspect was they referred to it as firmware updates, but what we would refer to as patching. The patching problem. They kind of talked about those three elements, and probably the most important or the most challenging problem to them, which I'll touch on a little bit, is the idea of how do you push out firmware updates, or how do you make sure that the system is on its most current version of whatever operating system they use. Right. And what they've done, I think, is actually kind of clever. I have a certain amount of skepticism, but basically what they've done is they've built a sort of a gold image into firmware that is resident on the printer. And of course, they expect to be able to push patches out and updates and be able to, rewrite the firmware when necessary. But they've actually built technology in the printer that sort of self-detects. It's almost like a built-in whitelisting. It's doing some sort of system checks to see if anything that it's running by itself has been modified or altered, or anything malicious has been done to it.
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously Microsoft's the shining example of that, correct? In terms of recognizing there's an update available, verifying that the update I'm getting is in fact the update I should be getting, and applying that update, and then forcing the user or the system to fully apply that update by forcing a reboot, as an example, right? And that needs to be applied to embedded systems and or IoT devices, specifically printers. I would, Jeff, to just back up for a moment, I would add that I think there's a fourth aspect of printer security that I think that they kind of left out, and that is the integrity and privacy, and more so the privacy of data that flows to the printer and out of the printer. More so from the workstation to the printer is typically could be sensitive information, right?
Right.
That you want to print out. So, and in devices that are more than just printers and scanners, if they're storing any of that information, obviously there's concerns there. How is it stored and who has access to it as well?
No, they actually did bring that up. There was a talk that went into the details of the challenges of printer security in and of itself, and that talk alone was overwhelming just in terms of, they spoke about confidentiality, integrity, and availability from a data security perspective, and they tied each one back to different things. Not only can a bad guy, just walk up to a printer and steal a printout. That's a problem.
Right.
But they can go into the memory and steal printouts, or like what you're saying, they can alter the data. If it's a medical report or something like that, financial report, a paycheck. There's any number of reasons where the data could be altered, and that's an issue.
Right. It speaks to integrity. Yep. Okay.
Yeah, speaks to the integrity. Availability, obviously, is a big deal. I mean,
and like, how many of us worked in IT support? Like, raise your hand. If you're driving, keep both hands on the wheel. But if you worked in IT support, like, raise your hand. And how many of us still cringe to this day when we think about the support calls that we got, where people I can't print. And like how just immediately depressed you were because you knew what you were in for if someone couldn't print. Not only is it often a difficult problem to solve from a driver compatibility software perspective, but it's like a mission critical thing. Like, I don't know, it's probably less true today than it was years ago, but if someone can't print, like, business operations would stop. And still to this day, there are instances where business operations require an actual paper document. I know Sam, our operations, but we go through this all the time, right? As much as we can, it's all digital. But like, sometimes you just got to print it out.
Right, and, so, Chris sort of alluded to it in our previous section. They had systems when Aramco was compromised where they couldn't print out a contract, and I'm sure they probably had to print out the contract so she could sign it, and so they had to go on the honor system. But they had an interesting statistic. They said on average, corporations, enterprises, obviously larger companies, have one printer per every 10 employee these days.
Yeah, and
some of their larger companies, the customers, have tens of thousands of printers that they're managing. So, they did have a talk talking about all the things that can go wrong with sort of the print data, and that's before you even start to have a discussion about how the printer is essentially an endpoint on the network and can be used for compromise and pivoting and gaining access to other parts of the network. So by the time that talk was over, I'm like, geez, how can companies focus on all these different things of printer security? Yeah. And that's just a small piece of the overall network security problem. So, it makes sense for vendors producing these types of endpoint devices to try to make them as secure as possible and to try to make them self-detecting and self-healing, which is what they've attempted to do. So the printer itself is monitoring itself to make sure that it isn't being attacked or compromised or being hit by any kind of malware. And if it does detect something, it forces the reinstallation of the gold image, and then it immediately goes out and looks for the latest firmware updates and gets those installed before anything else can happen. And so it's all supposed to be automatic and transparent, and that part of it seemed pretty cool. And I think that was consistent with discussions we've had about how vendors need to take responsibility for, their devices and build more secure devices. I'm not sure some of the devices that we've talked about the last couple months, if it makes economic sense to build a gold image into embedded, chips on whatever the devices are and all that kind of stuff. But at least it's a concept, or it's an approach that
right. And to do that reliably, and the importance of doing it reliably varies on the application. In terms of a printer,
sure,
versus a thermostat, which is regulating temperature, maybe for sensitive areas of the. I know I worked at university, right? There were research labs that some of which housed animals for testing, and so like the temperature was a big deal, obviously.
Right.
But when you talk about printers, yeah, users will squawk with a printer, but I have more confidence in a self-healing, more automated process that I think all of us have to adopt. We just did an interview about DevOps and automation and how important that is. But in terms of a printer, I think we can be a little more kind of forgiving if printer update doesn't work, and there is an easy way to recover from that with human intervention. So in your example, Jeff, when you have tens and thousands of printers, if you're at 95, 98%, or self-healing, and then humans have to kind of spend a little more time with the ones that need extra attention, I still think that's a winning scenario in this case.
Right. Well, I remember early in my career when I was working for an organization, let's say, where the printer, there was like one printer per an entire floor, and it was out in the hallway, and it was about the size of a VW Beetle, and you'd submit your print job and go out and just kind of stand in the queue and wait for your print to come out. And of course there was all sorts of problems then of people showing up and taking their print jobs, people accidentally taking somebody else's print job, and so on and so forth.
Because that header page with your username on it is important.
Right, username and maybe classification.
Right,
it happens to be a government type of organization. But my last office that I worked at, which was where you and I used to work, there was half dozen printers on the floor, and if one wasn't immediately responding, you just move on to the next
one. Yep, that's a good point.
So from a user perspective, I the one way to do it is there's more choices. They touched a little bit on regulatory requirements and compliance. They brought up PCI, HIPAA, ISO 27001, the NIST cybersecurity framework, and of course, I keyed in on PCI, and I think it's true for pretty much all the standards, and they pretty much confirm this. There's really no specific mention in any of those documents about secure your printers.
Yeah.
There's certainly language about configurations and hardening and changing default settings, which if you're thinking about it and if you sort of connect the dots, you would apply that to printers. But there's nothing in any of the regulatory standards that says do this for printers.
Even in in a retail environment, the printers that are printing receipts are typically not like a network kind of thing. They're just connected to the register, right?
Yeah, they're typically a peripheral, but the only thing that's mentioned in PCI about printouts is it's a hard copy. If it's got a credit card on it, you need to protect it.
Right.
There's no explicit reference to the printer is a device that is subject to all the
typically the last control. 4 of your credit card might be on a receipt, if that.
These days.
Oh, sorry, guys. Just if I can interrupt, in any of your conversations, did HP feel like the security community had unfairly criticized them in past or recent history?
I didn't get the impression that they felt like they were unfairly criticized. They certainly acknowledged that they have been subject to criticism, and I think more or less they owned it. And I think that was probably one of the reasons why they're trying to be proactive in seeking out the security and the tech community to try to promote or get feedback on what they've been doing in terms of print security. Now, it's a mixed bag. Some of the things that I think that they could possibly improve upon is, for one thing, that it was brought out that all that they've done is basically available for their enterprise printers. They haven't really they haven't touched, addressed, and all these features are not available on printers that are shipped to a consumer. So from an Internet of Things perspective, they haven't really, it's a complex problem like we've acknowledged, and they haven't really figured that out because all the stuff that they've done costs money, and they want to recoup it or possibly make money. So the security features that they were talking about are an add-on to enterprise quality printers. So it's something that at the end of the day they're selling. They're a business; they're allowed to try to make money. I don't have too much of a problem with that, but it is a larger problem of they haven't fixed the problem for the consumer side of things. They talked about trying to some degree, but it doesn't sound like they're really thinking about it seriously, trying to get an audience with any of the regulatory boards to try to get printer security or any aspect of printer security more explicitly mentioned in terms of the standards. And the one area that they didn't touch on, and I never did get the opportunity to ask him. We've had discussions about within the IoT security topic of government intervention, government regulation, at a high level. There was no mention that they're doing any type of work at the federal level in terms of trying to influence or lobby to get more standards out there for printer security. Doesn't mean they're not doing it; they just didn't happen to bring it up.
Hey Jeff, did you get a sense that some of the enterprise solutions that they're putting out for the big iron sorts of printers is that going to potentially trickle down into the sort of small medium space and even consumer space?
Well, that's what I was just alluding to, Joff. From what they said, no. Maybe down to the small mid-size, but really what they're focused on right now is the enterprise, the companies that are buying thousands of printers. They didn't talk about price points, so I don't know how much these additional features cost, but they certainly implied that smaller companies and certainly the consumer that's used to at this point getting what are printers these days, $50 or something like that. They certainly hadn't figured out how to extend it down to there, which kind of raises an interesting point in terms of what we know about printers in terms of security and what they have taken the steps of turning things off. There's a default setting when you plug it in, but they've got this classic problem of it's a printer. People that buy printers want it to work. They want it to plug in and be able to use it, and so they leave a lot of things enabled, leave a lot of things turned on, which is sort of a classic problem of installing a new system. But certain things that we would probably take great offense to, like certain insecure protocols. That should never be used these days, but somebody raised the point that they're not enabled by default, but the daemons are still running. They're still resident on the printers. Things like Telnet, things like FTP. So a question was asked: why in 2017 are printers still being shipped with some of these basic protocols that nobody should really be using anymore, and have all sorts of history of having problems, and that's the way they get exploited and things like that. And for better or for worse, the response was, well, it's a compatibility issue. Essentially, it's this classic. We want them to be able to work when the customers plug them in, so they have everything available, if not enabled, and it's up to the users to set the configurations properly. But we all know that isn't reliable. So
yeah, I mean, Linux went through that in like the late 90s, right? I mean, remember Red Hat Linux, everything was enabled, and they realized that, hey, every time someone builds a Red Hat Linux system and puts it on the internet, all of a sudden there's a bunch of wares on it. It's the second show I had to reference that. But that's the same model that HP's going through, right? Well, Red Hat was like, well, I want to make it usable for everyone. But that
I would even say, Paul, that is the same model that almost all of these various operating systems are going through, right? The Internet of Things is going through the same thing. You pick your device. Printers have gone through it. Microsoft went through it. Everybody goes through that curve, right?
Yeah.
Of what's the sweet spot of balancing effectively what is operational availability versus security.
Well, you have one chance to make a first impression, and I think it speaks to getting user adoption when these technologies are new and coming to the market. When Red Hat wanted more users, well, let's make it easy and turn everything on for everyone, and then they realized that was a bad idea. IoT devices and Microsoft and software, Raspberry Pis, right? Good example. There's a default username and password. I think it all speaks to trying to get users to adopt that technology by making it easy for them to use it by making these things just on by default or default passwords that are easily recognizable by the end user. And I think, like you said, Joff, hopefully, eventually, in all cases, we mature out of that strategy. It sounds like that's what HPs should be doing anyway.
Yeah, absolutely.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Go ahead. No, I'll throw it back to you, Jeff. Keep going.
Well, I think, to some degree, I think, a company like HP producing printers, they probably at some point could get to the point where they stop shipping with some of the default insecure protocols being available, having the daemons there resident themselves. Yeah, I think there's a certain amount of, we don't know what's going to happen if we stop shipping that. We don't know what enterprise customer is doing some weird thing that they're relying on it that we're going to piss people off. Sometimes it just boils down to you got to pull the trigger and go for it. It reminds me of my early days of consulting where we were trying to convince companies that they needed to install a firewall if they were going to be connected to the internet, and the firewall needed to block certain things. And one of my customers was a university, and they were dead set against filtering anything. They didn't want a firewall because it was all about academic freedom, and they wanted their.
I was there, dude. I was right there.
I figured it would resonate with you, Paul. But they didn't want to turn anything off because they didn't want to piss off any of their tenured professors and so on and so forth.
Well, and what the funny part about that is, and slightly off topic, is that I was actually hired at the university because I had experience with firewalls, and they were implementing their first firewalls, and there was a very smart person. I didn't realize it so much at the time. It was a really smart person that was opposing this concept of firewalls. And his argument, it turns out, as I learned and matured years later, was extremely valid. Right? His arguments against firewalls are kind of hard to debate, right? And it's that age-old thing, like, why are we just putting up a wall and not, actually securing the endpoints and all of these things? That person was actually Steve Carmody, who is one of the lead founders of the Shibboleth project. Many of you have mentioned. Steve has been on the show since I've worked in the university as well, and is just a really awesome and very interesting person. So.
Well, I mean, we solved it at the university I was working with by simply saying, we promised we did a round table and all the department heads came in, and we assured them that they would still be able to do what they were accustomed to doing. They just needed, we just needed to know what it was so that we could enable that through the firewall. And once they got over you're not going to block me from doing anything, they were okay with it. Because in those days, the rule of thumb was plug in the firewall, turn it on, wait for the phone to ring. And then you could go through the business justification of whoever's on the other end of the phone. Are they really doing something legitimate? And is it something that should be allowed or not? But those were the early days. So anyway, just to wrap
in conclusion,
up, the lab tour, as I said, was amazing. They showed us a printer they call it the waterfall. They printed 5 copies of a 3 foot by 4 foot full color map. It happened to be a map of the continent of Africa. And once the thing warmed up, these printouts, all 5 copies were done in probably about 8 seconds.
Wow. Wow. And going back to your example, Jeff, of waiting in line at the printer, waiting for, like, it seemed like hours I had to wait. I'm like, I'm just printing a 1-page document, for crying out loud.
Right.
Or God forbid it was what are the old school printers with the papers with the holes on the end? What were those called?
The IBM ones with the
dot matrix printer.
Dot matrix.
There's a bunch of people screaming dot matrix at me. I apologize for not having a mental block there. Yeah, like dot matrix printers, like it made that noise, like, and you just sit there like,
well, yeah.
All right, that was one line.
Not only were they extremely slow, they were extremely noisy. Like you couldn't have a phone call and be in the same room as a printer.
I mean, it's a better noise than one of the old school modems. I kind of liked the printing noise. I thought it was kind of relaxing, to be honest with you. It meant work was being done. Something was being created. Right.
But and you gotta hand it to HP in the early days. That laser printer image was really revolutionary change.
Yes.
Yep. Well, and they've apparently got dozens, if not hundreds, of patents that are all sorts of revolutionary changes to printing. I mean, way beyond my capacity of understanding. The tour was given by a guy that's been at HP like over 30 years.
Oh, Jeff, one last question.
Sure.
Did they address the issue where in the TV show CSI Cyber, there was that hack that like remotely they could set someone's printer on fire? Like, I kind of think that might have come up, like them kind of mocking that, because I thought it was ridiculous. The show was ridiculous.
They didn't mention it in reference to the show, but they did mention it. And somebody asked the question: is it true that you can really, set a printer on fire? And they were adamant that it is not possible because there's some sort of internal thermostat or something that shuts everything down.
There's a hardware limitation, as we understood, and that's good that we can confirm that too. I mean, obviously,
it's confirmed.
When you speak about patents, I would surmise that there is a patent to that mechanism, right, that protects that, or some kind of proprietary, of course, technology. That obviously that would be a big deal if you're a printer company to make sure that your products are not being set on fire.
Yep.
Just saying.
So props to HP for doing this. I think it was a valuable experience. I think they're doing a lot of good things. Have they solved every problem? No, but none of us have.
I think they're
taking an effort.
Yeah, and props to them for reaching out to those in the security community to get advice as well. I think that's cool. Yep. So, with that, we'll take a short break, come back, and talk about the security news for this week.